Good evening, everyone. Good evening. It is great to be back with all of you after a 2-week hiatus. I was traveling throughout China. You can expect lots of content coming as soon as the editing is done because I was traveling throughout China doing many interviews. They will all be coming very soon, as soon as we can get those up. But today we are getting right back into it in the realm of geopolitics, and we are going to do so with a very special guest, someone who is returning to the program now after a bit of a brief period away. It is always a pleasure to be joined by Brian Berletic. He is the curator host of the New Atlas YouTube program, which you can find in the video description. Brian, it is good to be back with you this evening, your morning. Thanks so much for getting up.
Yes, it's quite early. I didn't get nearly enough sleep. I hope I make sense. It's great to be back. I'm not really doing a lot of interviews because, interviews and then actually doing an analysis, deep analysis, it kind of conflicts with a limited amount of time. But I'm happy to be here now, and let's see how much we can get through in about an hour or so.
Yes, let us do that, Brian. Well, to begin, everybody, let me just actually get everything up live on Rumble here. Okay, Rumble should be going live very soon. There we go. And now let me get Rockfin Community in here before I forget. Everyone, as you are watching this stream, please do hit the like button. That helps boost the stream and the algorithm. And of course, go to the video description where you can find Brian's YouTube channel, The New Atlas, as well as all the ways you can support this work on Patreon, Substack, and many more options. But Brian, we have a lot to get to because while I was in China, always there's a lot of developments occurring, and I wanted to begin, of course, with Ukraine. Now, the big story is that Vladimir Putin has reiterated they are having the Eastern Economic Forum in Vladivostok right now, and he reiterated that Donbass, the Donbass region, is the focal point of Russia's military operation and will be from here on out. This comes, of course, as the Kursk offensive has injected a lot of enthusiasm in the Western media and including Ukrainian officials. But I wanted to ask you what exactly is happening on the front lines, because there's also data suggesting that in the month of August alone, Russia has gained more territory than at any point since 2022, and that there's a lot of panic around this very strategic city of Pokrovsk, which Russia is approaching. So could you give an outline of what exactly is happening right now on the front line, and how this speaks to this a panic about Vladimir Putin's seemingly common sense words here?
Well, yeah, it's common sense. It's an obvious fact, but this is something the collective West needs to distract away from. So this is why they're creating some sort of controversy over this non-controversial statement. What has to be remembered is that the war in Ukraine is a war of attrition. Russia is not trying primarily to seize territory. They're primarily trying to destroy Ukraine's military. They're trying to wear down its manpower, its equipment, exhaust Ukraine's supply of ammunition, something which they are obviously succeeding at doing. Even the Western media admits this. At the same time, Russia is building up its own military power, constantly expanding its pool of trained manpower, its weapons, its equipment, its ammunition, the production of ammunition. They're also trying to grind down Ukrainian defenses. Most of Ukraine's defenses are in the Donbas region. This is where this conflict has been ongoing between the separatists and the Ukrainian government from 2014 onward, following America's political capture of Ukraine. Crushing these defenses and the forces manning them. Once you've done that, what is really fundamentally left of Ukraine's military? And little or nothing. Once they do that, then they can take as much territory as they want, or as realistically possible. Taking it before this is achieved will cost Russia more manpower, more equipment, more ammunition. So what they're doing is they're pacing themselves. They're not rushing to do this. They're doing it, and it's going to take as long as it takes. The incursion into Kursk, from the moment it happens, myself and many other analysts pointed out that Ukraine was already overstretched before they launched the incursion. They took some of their best manpower, best equipment, and sent it into Kursk. If you look at the type of territory that Ukraine is now holding in Kursk, it's a very remote region. They talk about holding something like 100 settlements, but when you look on satellite imagery, you can see that a lot of these so-called settlements are a single road with 3 houses on one side and 2 houses on the other side. So it's a very remote region. They were able to move into this region specifically because it was underdefended, because there's nothing there. The only strategic target that they could possibly have been aiming at, if there was something strategic they were going after, was the Kursk nuclear power plant, but they got nowhere near that. Russian forces have now contained the incursion. It has been a very long time since they made any significant progress, and there's no rush to push them out of Kursk, because for as long as they're there, Ukraine has to supply all of this manpower, all of this equipment. Men need food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, construction material for their fortifications that they will need to build if they plan on staying there for any long period of time. All of their machines require maintenance, spare parts, oil, fuel. So now they have this huge logistical line they need to establish to support these troops in Kursk. We're doing nothing to help the front in Donbass. And as myself and many others pointed out, this was only going to accelerate a process that was already well underway. The slow motion collapse of Ukraine's forces and their front lines in the Donbass region. We've seen this accelerate. It was already accelerating, but now the pace of acceleration itself has begun to speed up. And so this is looking very bad for Ukraine. But what people have to remember is that the United States from the very beginning was not trying to defeat Russia with Ukraine. They're trying to raise the cost as much as possible while there's still Ukraine left to use as a proxy against Russia. And one last thing, just as a warning to other nations, the U.S. has either politically captured and is using as a proxy or seeks to use as a proxy. This is what the U.S. has in store for them. I'm talking about the Philippines or the island province of Taiwan. This is what the U.S. will do to these places if they allow it. And unfortunately, the nature of political capture is you put a client regime into power that does not care about what happens to the administration or country that they're presiding over. So this is all something very important to keep in mind. Danny, your mic is muted.
I'm sorry about that. Yes, Ukraine is definitely a window into that reality that you just spoke about with regard to the larger geopolitical picture. But Brian, before we get to that, could you talk about the significance of Pokrovsk? Because I'm hearing it a lot in the Western media. There's a lot of fear, also a lot of fear mongering about what Russia is doing to get to this city. But there's also just a lot of fear that this city is on its way to being in Russia's control at some point in the near future. However, there's also mixed messaging, because you have Syrskyi, the head of Ukraine's armed forces, going on CNN talking about how things actually are under control and stable. So what is the reality here? Because on the one hand, you have the Institute for the Study of War, for example, a neocon think tank, talking about the front line basically collapsing for Ukraine in many areas, or at least a slow rolling collapse. And on the other, you have Ukraine's head of the armed forces saying everything's all right, everything is stable. So what's the reality here, and what's the significance of Pokrovsk?
Well, General Syrskyi has to say everything is under control, doesn't he? Because if it isn't under control, who is responsible for it being out of control? He's responsible for that. The reality is, and if you have been following this conflict closely, Russia's approach to Bakhmut, for example, the approach is very quick, because the defenses between the original line of contact and Bakhmut, those defenses are relatively light compared to taking Bakhmut itself. The process of taking Bakhmut took many, many months. The process of taking Pokrovsk is also going to take months. It's an urban area. It has much denser defenses than all of the area leading up to it. So what Syrskyi is trying to do is he's trying to say, well, look, Russian forces are slowing down. They're slowing down because they're right at the city right now. And it will take them a while to overwhelm the defenses in that city. But inevitably, they will take it, just like they took Bakhmut and more recently Avdiivka. People have to remember the line of contact at the start of this year, 2024, was actually Avdiivka. It was one of the most heavily fortified cities along the line of contact. And now it is held by Russia. Now Russian forces have advanced much further beyond that. If you look at the map, you can see how significant the advance has been this year and how much faster things are moving in favor of Russia than they were, say, last year or the year before that. So we have to keep in mind, again, it's a war of attrition. The primary objective of Russia's forces is to grind down Ukrainian forces. That's their primary objective. It's not to take any of these cities as quickly as possible. It is to destroy the Ukrainian forces in these cities. When those forces are depleted, they're going to be forced to withdraw. When they do, then that's when Russia will take the city. It's entirely different than the type of warfare we've seen, say, by the United States in all of the wars of aggression it has fought since the end of the Cold War. And this is the problem with Western military analysts. They seem to think that every war is going to be like Desert Storm or like the 2003 invasion or Afghanistan or even the intervention in Libya. But in reality, this is a completely different type of warfare. It is the type of warfare Russia has been preparing for many years. And it's a type of warfare that the United States and its allies are unprepared for and will not ever be prepared for because their entire system fundamentally is incapable of preparing for this type of warfare. And just to give one example of this, another thing we will see Ukraine constantly complaining about right now is air defenses. And I mean, the many times I've come onto your show, Danny, I've talked about how the collective West does not make enough air defenses. They don't make enough of anything, really. The air defenses in particular, extremely expensive, very scarce in the West. They don't have enough. Even before this conflict began, they didn't have enough just to send to Saudi Arabia when they were fighting Ansar Allah in Yemen. So how are they going to have enough to combat over 300 Russian missiles every single month, over 4,000 missiles a year? How are they going to defend against that? They cannot. And I was just looking at, because they're getting ready for their, I think it's monthly meeting at Ramstein, Germany, and they're going to roll out all of this military assistance that they're going to be giving to Ukraine. But if you pay attention closely, I was just looking at the UK, they announced 460 air defense missiles they will be sending to Ukraine. Number one, if you read it carefully, these missiles don't exist. They have to be produced. The first batch will not reach Ukraine until the end of the year. It'll probably be a year or two before all 460 are delivered. And when you actually think about the volume of missiles Russia is firing at targets across Ukraine every single month, and the fact that you need 2 interceptors for each incoming missile, that's not going to last more than 2 months. It's actually less than 2 months, 460 missiles. But they're not going to get 460 missiles at one time. So it'll be trickling in at a much slower rate than they actually need to use to defend against this. And it's not as if every month or every other month the UK will be able to supply this number of missiles. So this is a huge issue people need to pay attention to. It is unsustainable. There is no way for the West to support Ukraine in a way that Ukraine comes out of this with the advantage. There's just simply no way. All they're doing is trying to drag it out for as long as possible.
Yes, indeed. It definitely feels like that, Brian. Now, talk about you mentioned air defenses. There was an incident of an F-16 crashing recently amid a missile barrage, amid the fighting. And this has gotten the West actually quite, I think, hesitant to supply what little they do have to Ukraine from here on out. And there's also this question of long-range missiles, Brian. This Vladimir Zelensky, the now defunct president of Ukraine, has been asking for this for so long, the permission to not only obtain these long-range missiles, but then to use them on Russian territory. Maybe you could talk about the motivations here for Ukraine to keep going on like this, because the Kursk if we want to call it offensive incursion, I think is probably more proper. That seemed to create a narrative that Ukraine was kind of back in the game. But what exactly is the reality here, given that we still have Ukraine also begging for more, Zelensky begging for more, and the results don't seem to be adding up?
I mean, the Kursk incursion was designed almost solely to convince the world that Ukraine is still in this fight. And you would only need to do that if you were not actually still in the fight and you felt the necessity to convince people otherwise. So that's very important to understand. It's also, again, I want to point out the Kursk incursion has only accelerated all of the various crises Ukraine faces in terms of manpower, ammunition, weapons. In terms of long-range strikes into Russia, I'm just looking at this Guardian article that I will cover in my next video on Ukraine, which I think I will publish Sunday. It says Zelensky claims support waning for strikes against Russian occupiers, and they're talking specifically about Crimea. Now, all of this time, Ukraine has been authorized to strike Crimea with Western long-range missiles, the Storm Shadow and Scalp air-launched cruise missiles, ATACMS. What does this actually achieve for Ukraine? Absolutely nothing. They're wasting these missiles. They'll have a successful strike where they will actually hit an important high-value target. The problem is Russia has many more high-value targets than Ukraine and the collective West has long-range missiles to strike at them with. So now you're talking about extending this failed campaign for long-range strikes against Crimea into the rest of Russia. And just look at Russia on a map, how vast it is. And even if you don't want to count the far east of Russia's territory, just the western part of Russia and the Urals, where a lot of industrial production is taking place, you're going to take a very small number of long-range missiles that you have available to you, and you're going to spread it out over a much wider area. So you're already having no success concentrating them in Crimea. Now you want to spread them out across the rest of Russia. It is fishing for public relation points that will convince people to continue fighting on a little bit longer, which is the entire objective of the U.S. right now. We've even heard U.S. politicians openly say to the last Ukrainian, and they mean that, and they're going to try to continue this conflict for as long as possible. As long as there's Ukrainians willing to fight and they have weapons to send them, even if it's not, clearly not enough to win the conflict or even arrive at some sort of stalemate or even a semi beneficial a peace agreement for Ukraine, they will continue fighting because it's about overextending Russia, raising the cost as high as possible for Russia so that the next conflict, the next crisis the West tries to engineer against Russia, Russia will be that much weaker when trying to respond to it. That's the plan. That's their plan at any rate.
Yeah, what's been so interesting, and we can maybe close on this point about the battlefield, is that you have this Kursk incursion, which, as you said, Brian, is all about PR and boosting Ukraine's morale, and at the same time, or at least Ukrainian troops' morale, and at the same time, it seems to have elevated the panic about all of the risks that such an incursion that you've laid out so well really does involve and really does portend, because you also have Western media, you have the United States, you have the West, all talking about, yes, there is a lot of reasons to worry about maintaining this kind of operation. So, I wanted to ask you, Brian, given all of this, what do you make of the fact that it seems like everything Putin says now, it sounds the alarm? It's like a big bombshell development, everything he says about Ukraine, US, whatever it is. And then you have the fact that everything that Ukraine is saying, NATO is saying, US is saying, seems to carry like an inherent contradiction. Like Kursk, for example. Kursk was supposed to be both a huge morale boost, also a chip for negotiations, right? If you hold onto this territory, you have a chip for negotiations. But then Vladimir Putin and Russia will say, absolutely not. There will be no negotiations. The more you escalate, the less likely we are ever to talk to you. So what do you make of all this? It seems like there's a lot of chaos brewing in this conflict, and I'm wondering what you make of it moving forward.
Those are a lot of good points, Danny, that you just made there about negotiations. I mean, I think anyone following this conflict should realize by now that holding even a single centimeter of Russian territory, the Russian government is not going to negotiate until that territory returns to them. By the time that territory returns to Russia, Ukraine will be in such a much greater disadvantage. I mean, just look at the whole trajectory of this entire conflict from the moment the U.S. politically captured Kiev in 2014 up until now, how things have progressively gotten worse. The more Ukraine does what Washington tells them to do, the worse things have become for Ukraine. The longer they try to hold out to get better terms on Russia, the worse the terms actually become. People should remember that in the very beginning, with the Minsk agreements, well, actually, before they politically captured and deliberately divided the country with an anti-Russian regime in Kiev, they had Crimea. Ukraine had Crimea. Russia only took back Crimea, and Crimea joined Russia because of the openly and deliberately anti-Russian regime the U.S. put into power there. The Minsk agreement, Ukraine could have kept all of the Donbas region, minus Crimea at this point, because now we see it's getting progressively worse. But they deliberately strung Russia along, did not uphold the terms of the Minsk agreement. And so they precipitated the special military operation. In the beginning of the special military operation, they took the Donbas region. They had these other regions that they might have been willing to give back to Ukraine, if only they negotiated in the very beginning. But the West convinced Ukraine not to negotiate. So now they've lost Kherson and Zaporozhye, in addition to the Donbas region and Crimea. So you can see how this is getting progressively worse for Ukraine. Now Russian forces have re-entered Kharkov. They're never going to leave. They're only going to take back more and more and more of Kharkov. And so what you see developing is the incremental erasure of Ukraine, its absorption by Russia. Remember, Ukraine historically has always been part of Russia. It was part of the Soviet Union. Its independence from Russia is a relatively recent and short-term affair. And so this is what this client regime in Kiev is doing to Ukraine. It is erasing it through its belligerence, through its refusal to recognize reality and to negotiate on terms that are reflecting the best interests of the Ukrainian people and the Ukrainian nation, for whatever it's worth. So this is a process that will just continue. The United States obviously underestimated Russia, its military-industrial power, obviously. I mean, there are still Western analysts who cannot wrap their mind around how Russia is producing more weapons, more ammunition than the collective West. They can't wrap their mind around it. And even while they cannot wrap their mind around that, they're still talking about war with China, whose industrial base is many times greater than even Russia's. So there is a huge disconnect between the policymakers in Washington driving all of this. Obviously, the people in Kiev have no connection to reality at all because their decisions aren't actually made by them. It's made in Washington. And the further Washington diverges from reality, the more skewed these policies become and the more catastrophic the consequences are. And we see that playing out every day now in Ukraine.
Oh, yes, yes, indeed. And Ukraine is such a good example of this term that I hear the United States and Western mainstream media use with Kursk. They call it a gambit or a gamble, a risk. But I think what we're actually seeing with Ukraine over the course of this long period now of essentially becoming a NATO proxy is that the real gamble is doing that. We've seen Ukraine just absolutely destroyed by this. And it seems like that's going to be the path for Ukraine for quite a long time to come. But now, Brian, I wanted to talk to you about the larger risks, the geopolitical implications of where the conflict sits at this point, because right before I left for China, I had already been thinking about so many escalations have been made up this ladder. Kursk was kind of the, I think, almost like a coming to fruition of a lot of talks about hitting Russian territory, right? Belgorod, other parts of Russia, and NATO countries giving green lights to this when it had already been happening, but giving a green light certainly sends a message politically and geopolitically. Now, I wanted to show you actually a video by from Lloyd Austin, an interview that he gave, because I think it kind of sets the stage, and it's about the long-range missile question and his answer, which is to the question of whether Ukraine should have these missiles and whether they should be able to use them. I think his answer kind of perfectly encapsulates what we are talking about here with these escalations and these risks, while also showing how the U.S. is very much aware of these risks and also of maybe the folly of this whole project altogether. But here we go.
President Zelensky has repeatedly requested these long-range attacks inside Russia. Even allies agree. So what is stopping the United States from giving the go-ahead?
Again, I don't believe what is stopping the United States. I don't believe one specific capability will be decisive, and you know, I stand by that comment. I think Ukraine has a pretty significant capability of its own to address targets that are well beyond the range of ATACMS or even Storm Shadow, for that matter. And as we look at the battlefield currently, we know that the Russians have actually moved their aircraft that are using the glide bombers beyond the range of ATACMS. So this is an interesting argument, but again, I think, you know, for the foreseeable future, we're going to make sure that we remain focused on helping them do those things that are enable them to be effective in defending their sovereign territory.
Okay, that was difficult for Lloyd Austin that to answer that question, but yeah, your reactions to the fact that there are these escalations, it's almost like a runaway train toward war with Russia, but at the same time, I mean, just listening to Lloyd Austin, the confidence just doesn't seem to be very present. Your thoughts?
Well, again, that's another good point. And for people who remember the 2019 Rand Corporation paper extending Russia and this idea of sending lethal aid to Ukraine to precipitate a Russian intervention to hopefully overextend Russia and collapse it in a kind of Soviet-style collapse. It also said that the risks were Ukraine being destroyed in the process and also destroyed along with it U.S. credibility. And that's exactly what we are watching be destroyed right now. And when you see the Secretary of Defense of the U.S. talking like this, like you say, no confidence, and they know that if they authorize these long-range strikes into Russia, there will be a retaliation. Russia makes by far more long-range weapons than collective West does. The retaliation will escalate against Ukraine. We constantly hear about the full-scale invasion that Russia has conducted into Ukraine. But if you look at the conflict from 2022 up until now, you can see how Russia has gradually expanded it, escalated, Ukraine striking Russian energy infrastructure. Russia was already hitting Ukrainian infrastructure, but they had left a lot of it intact so that they could escalate. And as soon as Ukraine began striking Russian energy infrastructure, they started wiping out the rest of Ukraine's energy infrastructure. So there's always another rung up the ladder Russia reserves to escalate, specifically to maintain this leverage over the collective West. Something else that we've heard Russia talk about is providing long-range precision-guided weapons to other actors around the globe. Now, we all know the United States has hundreds of military bases all around the globe. We can see how ineffective they are against, say, Ansar Allah in Yemen. Imagine Russia providing even more capabilities to groups like this around the globe. The US military presence in Syria, extremely vulnerable, already coming under attack. Imagine if that escalated. So this is what Russia has done. And this is why I always tell people, because ordinary people get very frustrated about the pace that Russia is going at. They say, why isn't Russia doing more quicker? They're being patient. They're being strategic. They're removing their emotions from this. Ukraine specifically, the Ukraine and its Western backers specifically do things to try to provoke Russia. They do the same thing in proxy wars all around the globe. Israel's another example, is like the master of escalation and provocation. But what needs to be done is restraint, patience, and strategy. This is what Russia is doing, and this is why Russia is winning.
Yeah, I mean, it begs the question, why would Russia then take massive steps to perhaps accelerate the end of this conflict if, in fact, the risks of such you could call a gambit, as they always say, with the Kursk incursion, the risk of such a gambit actually could bring on far more consequences for Russia than right now, where Russia does seem to be on the path toward an eventual victory, and one that will come with, of course, costs, but far lower costs than the opposite option or the other option. So that gets me to, Brian, this question of, well, Russia is fighting a war of attrition here, and Russia is trying to manage the conflict. And I think much of the world that has been watching this conflict outside of the NATO sphere has been aligned with this to a large degree. But at the same time, there's always this threat of a larger confrontation. And I'm wondering about, where do you see this conflict going in terms of this larger confrontation you were speaking about? Because all the war gamers, war simulators, think tanks, they talk about it, they war game about it. But at the same time, it seems to be happening in this conflict the longer that it goes on. So there's almost this catch-22 even for Russia, right? Russia, war of attrition, trying to fight this conflict in a way that works for them. But then you also have on the other side NATO and the United States green lighting or outright provoking and pursuing policy that leads to a bigger confrontation. So where do you think this is all headed?
So Russia is going to obviously try to fight this war in the way that is most beneficial for Russia. It does not have infinite amounts of manpower, equipment. There are limits to its military industrial production. It always has to keep in mind the possibility of a direct NATO intervention. I mean, how can that be ruled out? I don't think that it should be ruled out. The possibility of the West escalating in many other ways. It's something we have to remember from the Rand Corporation paper in 2019. All of the options that were described there to extend Russia did not just pertain to Ukraine. They also talked about Georgia, the rest of the Caucasus region, Central Asia, and we've actually seen the United States try to exercise every single one of these options. So Russia has to keep all of that in mind. And then we have to remember that this is just one part of a much larger conflict. The U.S. isn't just trying to overextend and collapse Russia. It has, since the end of the Cold War, pursued a policy of global primacy. It wants to be the most powerful and utterly uncontested nation on Earth. So it needs to get rid of Russia, China, and the rest of the multipolar world, because all of it stands as a potential competitor to the U.S. I was just looking at a very old article from the New York Times, 1992. U.S. strategy plan calls for ensuring no rival develops.
Right.
And it just outright says the U.S. wants to maintain primacy, needs to eliminate any nation that could possibly compete with the United States. And if you read any of the national security strategy papers, doesn't matter what administration, Trump, Biden, Obama, Bush, Clinton, they're all identical. Essentially, they reflect this elimination of any peer or near-peer competitor. So that this is what the United States is doing. That is the whole point of this proxy war against Russia. That is the whole point of escalating against China and Asia Pacific. That is the whole point of eliminating Iran and its allies in the Middle East. That is the whole point of interfering and destabilizing Latin America. It does not want any center of power, either a nation or a collection of nations, being able to assert their own interest over American interests. American interests, in their mind, span the globe, are entitled to the entire globe. So we always have to look at every single one of these conflicts in that context. One last thing I wanted to talk about with the long-range missiles, you have to remember that it's not just Russia, it's also China. The US needs as many long-range standoff strike weapons as possible for any potential war it tries to provoke with China. So we've been hearing about the JSOM air-launched cruise missiles. This was a centerpiece of a potential war with China. If they start sending them to Ukraine, they have none to spare for China. They don't have enough to go to war with China. If they start sending them to Ukraine, then they're basically ending this conflict with China before it even starts, before they even provoke it.
Yeah, and that's been a concern, I feel, since really the beginning of the arms problem that you have covered so much in detail, Brian. Ever since, I think we can trace this back, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, to that vaunted Ukrainian counteroffensive. Once that ran out of steam, and it was quite quick, actually, that it ran out of steam quite quick. After that, yeah, but even leading into that, there was all this concern about, well, how much aid do we give for a Ukrainian counteroffensive versus how little, how much. And then after that, it's been a big struggle, even though, of course, we know that Ukraine's been getting something. But what does that tell us then, Brian? If even now the reports are, the aid could run out at any point. It's going to run out next week. There may not be enough. Yet Ukraine, Ukraine is bogged down in Russian territory. That's a huge escalation for such a dire problem. No,
exactly. It made absolutely no sense. But again, if you just remember that even in Kiev, the whole point is to just string this out for as long as possible. They needed the PR points, I guess, more than they needed the manpower and weapons. I guess they feel like, even though the front line is collapsing, think about it this way: the front line is collapsing in the Donbas region, and if they just kept all of their troops there, it would just keep collapsing, slowly collapsing. The price for Russia would be much lower than if they did this incursion into Russia and at least scored some PR points, boosted morale, and possibly got this to drag out even longer. Before the Kursk incursion, just think about all of the articles we were hearing about how, even in the Western media, how Ukraine is done, morale is destroyed, people have no hope of winning. And these were all things that we have all been saying since this all began, and we were called Russian propagandists for it. Then the Western media was reporting on this weekly, daily. And then the Kursk incursion helped give a boost, but it's entirely artificial. It is psychological, solely psychological. And what it has actually done is accelerate the actual crises behind the lack of morale that they were so worried about in the first place. So it's a lose-lose proposition no matter what they do. But what they're trying to do is keep it going for as long as possible and do as much damage as possible. The last concern that they have is of Ukraine itself. Its people, its territory, its military forces. That's the last thing they care about. They don't care about it at all, actually. And so this is something that they're willing to sacrifice to continue incurring as steep a price as possible for Russia. So we have to keep that in mind. We have to keep in mind that they're going to do the same thing with Taiwan and also the Philippines, also with Europe. I distinctively remember, this is something that I was wrong on. I had thought for sure that Europe was going to gradually continue working with Russia, continue working with China, because it served their best interest to do so. And any sort of continued subordination to the US was going to destroy Europe. But I was wrong, because they had politically captured the European government through the European Union. And the leadership there did not care about Europe's best interests. And they continued Europe's subordination to the United States. And now we see that this has begun destroying Europe itself. This whole conflict with Russia is destroying Europe. So it's not just Ukraine the US is willing to sacrifice. It is also Europe. They're willing to sacrifice everyone and everything to try to achieve this geopolitical objective of maintaining primacy over the globe. You have to remember, when they say no competition, no peer or near peer competitors, they mean Europe also.
Yeah. Yeah, and that 1992 New York Times article, it's almost certain that it was referencing what's now known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, written by then Undersecretary of State Paul Wolfowitz, a chief neocon, a legendary neocon now in the historical record. But a huge impetus behind that, of course, was after the fall of the Soviet Union. U.S. designs were not to envelop Russia simply as a new friend, a weaker friend, maybe a subservient friend to U.S. interests, but also to create a Russia, or to design a Russia that had no capabilities of rising again in any way, shape, or form to compete with the United States. And that is essentially what has led us to this point. I believe it led us to this point where Russia actually has been able to, in a different way, shape, and form, rise again in the world in terms of influence. And that has led to all of the U.S.'s policies of aggression toward Russia. So finally, to close on Ukraine, Brian, lots of talk about nuclear weapons lately, right? So over the last several months, you've had Russia conduct nuclear tests with Belarus on tactical nuclear weapons. You've also had commentary back and forth about, would Russia launch a strategic nuclear weapon to show the West that it has them in order to establish deterrence once again? Because even just recently, as the Biden administration makes its way out, we have talks about a renewed nuclear strategy, preparing for a three-front nuclear confrontation with Russia, China, and the DPRK. So, Brian, your final thoughts on how Ukraine has kind of opened up this global, or opened up maybe the Pandora's box of this larger agenda globally that we see from the West?
The ultimate irony is the narrative goes, Russia is so desperate and losing so badly that they're going to use nuclear weapons to try to regain control of the conflict, even though we can see it's the exact opposite. And we're hearing about nuclear weapons because the US is saying, well, we did this, we did that, it didn't work. Our enemies are getting stronger. What else do we have? And when you're panicking, what do they always go to? Well, what's more than artillery or long-range missiles? Nuclear weapons. And so that's how we're arriving at this. Russia knows that eventually they will get so desperate they will either try to intervene directly, or they will resort to something like nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, maybe, or even strategic nuclear weapons. So they have to be prepared. They have to make it abundantly clear to the collective West that they are ready for this escalation. That's what this is all really about. China building up its own nuclear arsenal. This is solely because they realized that the US would go as far as using nuclear weapons. That is how desperate they are to try to contain, encircle and contain China. And this has been a fear that they've had for a long time. And when you look at the historical records, the US considered using nuclear weapons during the Korean War and also the Vietnam War. And both of those wars were part of a much wider strategy to encircle and contain China. And they had also planned on how to use nuclear weapons to just annihilate China, because they realized that eventually someday China would begin to rise and could potentially surpass the United States and its collective alliance of other captured states. So it really is, it's projection onto Russia what the collective West is actually thinking about. We're losing. What can we do to try to regain the advantage? Well, we have nuclear weapons.
Indeed. Well, let's go to Asia now, Brian. I want to talk, of course, about China. What's always interesting, I was just in China for about 11 days and talking a lot about this topic we are going to get into, which is the South China Sea, the Philippines, and the larger U.S. military agenda, its priorities, its interests, and what the U.S. military is actually doing. Because we have, of course, in recent weeks, numerous confrontations, we can call them, skirmishes maybe, between the Philippines and China. And lots of talk in the Western mainstream media about how the United States is just not doing enough to contain China's aggression in the South China Sea. So, Brian, I know you had a lot to say about this, so I'm just going to give it to you.
Well, what's interesting is that a lot of people who follow my work on analyzing the conflict in Ukraine will say, Brian, you're 100% about what's going on in Ukraine, but you're 100% wrong about China. China's evil. They're a danger to the world. Look how aggressive they are in the South China Sea. But what people have to remember is, where does this narrative come from? This narrative of aggression in South China Sea come from? It comes from the U.S. State Department. It comes from all the very same sources we know for a fact are lying to us about what's happening in Ukraine. Those are the same sources lying to us about what's going on in Asia regarding China. If you look at a map of the various disputes in the South China Sea, it is not just between, say, the Philippines and China, or Indonesia and China, or Malaysia and China. All of these other countries have disputes with one another as well. Some of these disputes become so heated that they will seize fishing vessels operating in water they claim is theirs. They will send the crews back to their home country, but they will keep the boat. Sometimes they will very publicly destroy the boat. They'll blow the boats up publicly as a warning regarding their claim over this water. There are territorial disputes all around the globe. There was a territorial dispute not that long ago between the UK and France, and they mobilized their respective naval forces. It never came close to actual confrontation. It's just to say that these are disputes that do happen. And even though they get quite heated, relations overall between all of these countries are actually quite good. What the United States has done is insert itself into these disputes, and it's trying to escalate them beyond these kind of very local, limited disputes. They're trying to create a regional or even global conflict. And the reason they're doing this is as a pretext, number one, to maintain a U.S. military presence in Asia. Again, look at a map. The United States is not located in Asia. It's literally on the other side of the planet from Asia. So they have created all of these crises to justify a huge military presence in Asia. Tens of thousands of troops in South Korea and Japan, a growing military presence now in the Philippines, again, based on the pretext of supporting the Philippines in this dispute with the South, over the South China Sea. Again, the shoal that they're fighting over is submerged. There's nothing of value there. And the Philippines is claiming a semi-sunken World War II ship. This is where the Philippine military is based, on a semi-sunken World War II ship. This is what they're fighting over. If you've ever been to the Philippines, its population is larger than Thailand, and yet its GDP is much smaller. And why is that? Because its economy is dysfunctional. It has suffered for, I would say, generations. It had been a colony of Spain, and then from the late 1800s to 1945, it was literally a colony of the United States. They had fought a war of independence against the United States, which the U.S. utterly crushed using concentration camps, mass murder, torture. So this, just to give you the actual context of what is going on in Asia and how this is all shaped up over history. The United States, ever since the Philippines gained its independence in 1945, has always maintained a military presence there, has always attempted to reassert control over the Philippines using its so-called soft power, and it is using it as part of a admitted strategy to encircle and contain China. They do not want China to become a superpower. They do not want it to even have primacy in Asia. It's the largest, most powerful country in Asia, but the US says, no, China doesn't get primacy over Asia. We do. The United States does. So this is the actual source of this conflict. And the conflict with Taiwan and the rest of China is very similar. The US politically captured Taiwan at the end of the Chinese Civil War. The side that the US had been backing fled to Taiwan. To this day, the administration in Taiwan is called the Republic of China. And according to their own constitution, Taiwan is just one province of China. Even in their own constitution, they say this. So think about all of the propaganda the US has used to convince people that the Philippines is a poor victim of Chinese aggression. Taiwan is a victim of Chinese aggression, when in reality, it's the absolute opposite. Both of these are victims of U.S. aggression, U.S. political capture, and are being transformed into Ukraine-style proxies to be used against China in the same way the U.S. is using Ukraine against Russia. And it will have the very same outcome. The policy papers describing what will happen to, say, Taiwan are very similar to the 2019 RAND Corporation paper that admitted that a war with Russia in Ukraine will leave Ukraine utterly destroyed. They admit the exact same thing for Taiwan. Even if Taiwan wins its political independence, all of its infrastructure, its economy, everything will be destroyed. So how exactly is that a win for Taiwan? It isn't. But it will be a huge win for the US because it'll be an opportunity to knock China down a peg. Now, what's even scarier still is the US realizes it cannot win a military confrontation with China at this point off of China's coast. They know this, and you will even see this admitted in the Western media. So what their plan is, and this is a plan that they have been working on, again, for decades, is to cut Chinese shipping all around the world, to cripple the Chinese economy. Rather than win a war outright, they will cripple the economy by cutting Chinese shipping. Now, China knows this. This is why they've been working on the Belt and Road Initiative to kind of circumvent the sea lanes that are very vulnerable to the U.S. Navy. But the U.S. has been targeting this as well. I've been talking about this for years. Balochistan in Western Pakistan. The U.S. backs armed militants cutting the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. The U.S.-backed conflict in Myanmar is doing the exact same thing. Political interference here in Thailand, where I'm based, seeks to cripple joint infrastructure projects between China and Thailand to connect Southeast Asia to the rest of China. So that is the lay of this conflict. It is much bigger, much more dangerous. Danny, before the show, we were talking about this U.S. Navy Institute.
Yes, that's what I was about to ask you about. Yeah, to get into this, because I wanted to ask you about that article in a contrast or maybe comparison to China's capabilities, because there's a lot of assumptions made in that article regarding the U.S. Navy Institute. But you, please.
Well, it's titled "Prize Law Can Help the United States Win the War of 2026." So we always hear about how China is rushing to go to war with the U.S. over Taiwan, but actually it's the other way around. China knows that in time it's just getting stronger compared to the U.S. And the longer China goes without going to war over Taiwan, the better it suits China. So it's actually the U.S. racing towards war with China because they see a window of opportunity closing. So there's this one. There's also another one from the same U.S. Navy Institute. It's titled "Navy Could Sideline 17 Support Ships Due to Manpower Issues." Maybe I'll send that one to you in the private chat here. You could put that one up also. U.S. does not have enough ships, does not have enough warships, it does not have enough support ships. They don't have enough people joining the Navy to sustain what they even have, let alone expand any of it. The actual production of ships in the U.S. compared to China is so drastically in China's favor that the U.S. could destroy the entire Chinese fleet and China would be able to basically rebuild it. And the United States wouldn't be able to replace any of its ships in any reasonable amount of time. So this is how dire the situation is. A lot of people in the U.S. try to compare, we're going to repeat World War II in the Pacific against China. But in actuality, it will be the U.S. taking the place of Japan, where it does not have the industrial means to actually fight and win this war that they're planning with China. So they don't have enough ships. They don't have enough warships or support ships. So that's how we get to this other essay about how they will seize Chinese ships and repurpose them to support the US Navy. Which I don't think is a sustainable prospect, but what it does point to is an overarching strategy of targeting Chinese shipping all around the globe, far beyond the reach of China's actual military, because China's military is in China. It's not stretched out around the globe like the US. So that's what the US is trying to do, play to its own advantage. The fact that it has military bases all around the globe, it can strangle Chinese shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. It can strangle it in the Strait of Malacca. It could even contest it in the South China Sea itself, despite the Chinese military presence there. And then even beyond that, it could contest Chinese shipping. And the hope is crippling the Chinese economy and leaving the US, again, primacy over the planet. Now, think about this, though. This is the real thing people need to keep in mind. Who does China trade with all around the globe? Practically the entire world. So a US war on Chinese shipping is a US war on the global economy. It will destroy the entire global economy. It will only be the US as it decouples, and this is very deliberate. It's decoupling from China. It may be catastrophic in terms of economic progress in the US, but it'll leave it in a much more advantageous position versus China and the rest of the world it hopes to collapse. So this is what we're talking about. This is how desperate the US has become. They are so desperate, they're willing to destroy the entire global economy. And then they will be the ones ruling the ashes on the other side of this conflict. This is where we are right now. I don't think a lot of people realize that this is where the US is, and this is what they're actively working on. Now, you could say, well, Brian, that US Naval Institute paper, that's just an essay, some what is it, major, some US Marine Corps major wrote. Well, the ironic thing is the US Marine Corps has already been completely transformed solely to fight China and solely to attack and interdict Chinese shipping. So this is something they're definitely doing.
Yeah, and it certainly is something that China is preparing for. When I was in China talking to various experts, I talked to Joe Bo about this, who was a colonel in the People's Liberation Army for the Air Force, and now a widely known expert. You know, when I was talking to him about this, there's always a calm. There's always a calm about it because China has been preparing for this. This is why the United States freaks out all the time about China's military growth. China is directly responding to external threats, i.e., the United States, and has been preparing in a very intelligent way. Very, as you said, it is very much based in and around China's own territory. It has been preparing for this upcoming war and a war of defense for quite a long time, and now has very modern means to fight it. But I wanted to show you something, Brian. I wanted to show you this there. I don't know if you caught this in The Economist. They're talking about nuclear war with China already, but there's something very interesting about this. I'm not going to go over the whole thing. I want to go down to this it proves exactly what you are saying, right? Exactly what you were saying about who exactly is the aggressor here. Because as the Center for New American Security, I believe, yes, Center for New American Security, that's who does these war games. They seem to do them every year. But they talk about all the reasons why China has these advantages in a so-called nuclear war that might happen. And look at this, Brian. Asia is chock full of American facilities and naval assets, giving China a wide range of targets. The American team, however, struggle with the fact that many of the most attractive targets for retaliation were on the Chinese mainland. Striking those with tactical nuclear weapons would carry a much higher risk of escalation into a general nuclear war. So they're talking about the differences between using tactical nuclear weapons in a war versus moving up that escalation ladder. But Brian, that's exact. They're literally admitting it, that the most attractive targets against China would be in China. Why? Because China does not have an expansive military project. Anyway, your thoughts?
No, exactly. And that's not just that particular think tank. Every single policy paper put out by US government arms industry funded think tanks will admit that China's military is based in China. It is a defensive force, a truly defensive force. They will brag about how they don't have the means to strike at the continental United States. And then the other problem that they're always, just like you're saying, the other problem they're always complaining about is how they have to, their logistical lines, the US logistical lines to sustain any kind of war with China stretches all the way around the globe, because the US is literally traveling to the other side of the planet to start this war with China. Now, remember how I said before we started on China, how people will say, Brian, you're right about Ukraine, but you're completely wrong about China.
Yeah.
I see even in the comment section, people talking about the social credit score, which does not exist. This is a U.S. State Department talking point. Follow the money. Follow the sources back to where this claim starts at, and you will find yourself repeating U.S. State Department propaganda. So if you realize you're being lied to about Ukraine, but then you're going to repeat stories about China coming from the exact same sources, you need to kind of sort that out, because that's very serious. That's a very serious disconnect from reality. If you read even the Western media about the social credit score, if you read all the way down to the end of the article, they will admit it doesn't exist. So people have to be a little bit more clever. Look at how dangerous it is to buy into the lies of the US establishment. Look at what it has done to Ukraine. Ask yourself where America will end up if people in America buy even half of the lies the US State Department tells. So maybe you ignore or are aware of the lies the US tells about Ukraine, but if you're buying into the lies about China, well, I will say the conflict the US is engineering with China is much more dangerous and existential to the US than any conflict with Russia. So I just hope people challenge themselves to look into these claims that they're readily repeating. Where did those come from? What sources of information told you these U.S. State Department narratives? Ask yourself, why are those sources repeating U.S. State Department narratives? There's a lot to think about there.
Oh my gosh, when you brought up social credit score, I was scrambling to find on my phone. I thought I had taken a picture of it, but the people I was with in China, they think it was very funny that the Americans think that there's such thing as a social credit score, because so in China they have these apps, WeChat, Alipay, where you can pay for things independent of cash. It's not a bank account, but you're able to draw from your accounts, put money on it, and then buy things. And on these apps, you can actually build a credit score, so to speak, where if you have, let's say, a good record of paying for things on time, of buying many things using it, then you can build up this credit score, and you may get like a reward or something. You may get like some kind of sale on something, or pay less for an item that may be a little more expensive for someone who has a lower credit score. But people were just joking about, oh, this is the social credit score. This is a social credit score that you're always that America, in America, they're always talking about. And so that's how cheap the propaganda gets, is that these very basic things, some of which are actually advancements, right? It really does accelerate, if you think about it, having entire apps dedicated to this fast-paced kind of consumption lifestyle. It's an acceleration of of economic development, but it's being framed as repression, right? Of Chinese people are being tracked and surveilled based on what they do and how they behave. And it's like, nope, it's simply just what every country in the world basically has that is any kind of credit system. It's the same thing. But anyway, yeah, I mean, back to the larger problem here, though, Brian, it does seem like this a growing move toward a war with China is actually continuing to grow, but it's not getting the same kind of attention now. Talk about these developments, especially vis-a-vis the Philippines. Maybe we can go back to it. What is your understanding about what the U.S. is saying about this versus what the reality is regarding? Um, you can talk about the U.S.'s military presence actually, because we're not getting much of that in the Western media right now.
Well, it's very important to understand what you just said. This is happening. This is happening at an accelerated rate, and it is all happening under the radar. The United States is building military facilities in the Philippines right now. They're building ports, airstrips. They are going to use this for a war against China, not just over Taiwan potentially, but again, also to target and cut Chinese shipping all throughout the region. And of course, they have their military bases elsewhere around the globe that they will be using to cut Chinese shipping. They have a whole strategy where they plan on building a whole network of air bases. And the reason why is because they realize, yes, China is gaining more and more advantages. Again, as time goes by, they're admitting this. They have the largest, most versatile missile force on the planet. The U.S. has nothing to even come close to comparing to this. And they're worried that China will just wipe out U.S. bases across the region in the first wave of missile strikes. So what they're doing is building a large number of air bases that they can spread their air force out. Now, I don't think this is a viable strategy because you spread your bases out. You have a couple of planes here, a couple of planes there. You need to have maintenance crews for all. You have to divide up your maintenance crews. You need more maintenance crews for the same number of planes because you've spread them out now. So I don't know how they're going to get around that. And I think they're going to run into the same problems they're running into in this conflict with Ukraine, where they think they're very clever and innovative, and then it turns out it's not nearly as practical as they thought when the missiles start to fly. But regardless, they're working on this feverishly. This is their top priority. The conflict against Russia, they were hoping that this would go much faster, just like they hoped Syria would collapse much faster. Well, it didn't collapse at all. They hoped Libya would collapse much faster than it did, even though they finally succeeded at that. And so the timeline just keeps getting stretched out further and further and further. And as it does, China becomes more and more capable. They're racing towards this conflict at such a disadvantage, and a growing disadvantage, that if and when this conflict finally happens, I think it's almost a certainty that they will try to provoke some sort of conflict. It will be catastrophic, and it could be catastrophic for all involved, because even if China were to win, but their international shipping was crippled, what is that going to do to the economy? Just look at what the whole COVID thing did to the global economy. Just imagine that on a much larger and much, I would say it was already deliberate, but this would be much more deliberate and direct in the way the U.S. would be trying to hurt the global economy. So have to prepare. And we see China, and we saw the Western media reporting on China stockpiling essential raw materials and resources. Why are they doing all that? Because they know this is coming. They can see this as clear as day that this is coming, and they're preparing for it. We have to wake up and realize what is happening. And again, I just think it's such a tragedy that even in the alternative media, there's so many people poisoned against China, repeating State Department lies. And this is actually going to make this conflict that much worse. It'll drag it out longer and make it that much worse. If there was shrinking support across the American population for this, it would complicate their attempt. They would still try to do it, but it would complicate it greatly. The fact that so many people, and they should ask themselves honestly, why they hate China so much. Is it because Russia looks like Westerners, like white Westerners? China does not. Is that the reason why? People should seriously ask themselves. And is that a reason to go along with this project the U.S. is pursuing, the potential of destroying the global economy in the process? People should think about that carefully. But this is something they're speeding towards, and this is something we have to raise awareness for. The conflict in Ukraine attracts the headlines. It is a hot conflict. People want to know what is going to happen. But this is a much greater conflict brewing, and we have to be well aware of this. And not just the direct conflict between the U.S. and China, but all the interference the U.S. is involved in. We didn't even talk about Bangladesh or here in Thailand, where the U.S. has political oppositions that it is either maneuvering and seizing power in these countries and then turning them against China, or in the process of trying to, dividing and destabilizing these countries in the process. This is their strategy. This is what they're doing.
Yeah, perhaps we can spend the last 20 minutes or so on this larger global strategy vis-a-vis a brewing war with China, because it is my estimation, especially after this last trip that I took to China, that the only reason why, in my opinion, there hasn't been a Ukraine level conflict with China yet is because of both, one, China's capabilities, yes, militarily, but two, and maybe I'm not ranking them at all, but two might be the most important one, is that China's economic role in the world is so essential that no kind of economic war plan that they try to institute, NATO and the US tried to institute with Russia, had any possibility of working. They gambled with Russia and it failed. But I think there's actually a wide knowledge of the fact that it would fail and fail dramatically. But Edwin, a YouTube member, had a great question. How will China help Iran in a war with the US, Israel? And I wanted to ask you, Brian, about this growing multipolar world, about China's role in it, of course, Russia's too, because I think that there's a lot to say in this realm of geopolitics and military conflict of how China is conducting itself. And we could also talk about Russia, but really how China is conducting itself, I think it speaks a lot to not just this question, but also similar kinds of questions. So your thoughts?
Well, the way China is supporting Iran or Russia or any number of countries around the globe is economically. They are an alternative and a lifeline economically for these countries that the U.S. is trying to encircle and contain and isolate economically. So all of these sanctions that the U.S. is trying to put on Russia and coercing Europe into cutting Russia off, well, Russia was able to pivot toward China. And they were able to circumvent all of these sanctions. Their economic prospects are actually brighter by turning eastward. Same goes for Iran. Same goes for India. If India is able to move past a lot of the I would say colonial baggage from when they were a colony of Britain, all of the divisions they have internally, if they're able to move past their various holdups with China, and in many ways they already are, they will benefit, and China will benefit from working with all of these countries. So that's basically how they're doing it. A lot of people say, well, why doesn't China just send weapons to all these countries, and why don't they send troops and help Russia win this conflict and help Iran win that conflict? That's just not how things work. I mean, even if they wanted to, they couldn't, because they don't have a military designed for projecting power like that. So there's no way for them to do that. So we have to keep these things in mind. Economic support is so essential, and it shouldn't be downplayed just because it's not leading headlines and at the center of these conflicts that we're watching play out on the battlefield.
Yes, indeed. I mean, one of the critical points here to me is that China's economic development, its assistance, its kind of relationship that it holds with really the global majority, not just Russia. I mean, the Russia-China partnership, of course, super important. China, Iran, its relationship, very important. And I think these are really big examples of how China conducts itself with the rest of the global majority. I mean, when I was in China, Brian, I can tell you that this is just unheard of, in my opinion. You had the Forum on China and Africa Cooperation leading into it. The leaders had just gotten there. There was a foreign ministers meeting before the presidents and various leaders got together. The main road, Chang'an Road, main street, right, goes past Tiananmen, Mao's, Xi Jinping's office, right? Like, it goes past all of the Great Hall of the People. It cuts through. It's a huge road. It's a very critical one, actually, if you know how Beijing is constructed, if you're in that part of town. And the traffic was so bad. Why? because China basically not only rolled out the red carpet, but basically reserved that entire space for the African delegates. Like, unheard of. Like, they were basically, they were given top priority. It didn't matter how it affected cabs and drivers. It doesn't matter. This is the priority. And you can just see that in, all of these state visits, for example. Look at how Bashar al-Assad, Syria's president. Look at how Nicolas Maduro has been treated. Every time Vladimir Putin goes to China, look how Vietnam's new president was treated, right? Rolling out the red carpet and treating essentially global majority leaders, leaders of the multipolar world, not just as equals. In my opinion, they're treated as just the most important leaders of the world right now. And I think that sends a huge, not only does it send a huge message, but I think it does bear really important results. Perhaps, Brian, you could talk about some of those results that you've been studying, because I know you do follow China's interconnectivity network, the Belt and Road Initiative, and other development projects.
As well, I know it's hard for some people to believe, but China works on mutually beneficial partnerships. It wants to get something out of it. Obviously, they're not doing it out of the pure goodness of their heart, but they also want their partners to prosper as well. They understand that in the long term, that is the most sustainable way to grow economically and politically in terms of power and wealth. That is the way that you grow sustainably. What the West does, like a swarm of locusts, they descend upon a targeted nation and they strip mine it until there's nothing left, and then they move on. And when you operate your government, your foreign policy, your economy in this way, it is unsustainable. You cannot sustain it. Just like a swarm of locusts reaches a critical mass and then collapses, that is what's going to happen to the Western system of doing things. And they had a good run for generations because of the disparity between themselves and the rest of the world in terms of economic and military power, and that was owed to technology, but that playing field has leveled. The way forward is obviously through mutually beneficial cooperation. The West just simply cannot see that. It's too deeply ingrained into the establishment. They cannot see it. They cannot see that the policies they themselves are pursuing are going to eventually undo them. They just literally cannot see it and cannot change. China, on the other hand, is trying to construct an alternative system. Multipolarism is about a balance of power, not a monopoly of power. We saw it from the New York Times itself admitting in 1992, and this has not changed since then, U.S. foreign policy is to dominate the planet. Domination, not cooperation, not multipolarism, unipolarism, U.S.-led unipolarism. And that's where the battle lines are actually drawn. So I always encourage people to, okay, yes, you're following the conflict in Ukraine or in the Middle East or in Asia Pacific, but zoom out and see how they're all connected and how this really is a battle between unipolarism and domination versus multipolarism and cooperation. And the multipolar system is something that will require constant effort to maintain, because the reason the West has caved into domination is because it's a core pillar of human nature in general. I mean, humans by nature want more money and power. People using their reason and their logic realize how unsustainable that is. And so they talk about balance and sustainability. That takes constant effort to maintain, whereas the West is a bit like a tropism. It's just a natural process playing out. And when it becomes unsustainable, it will collapse. Just like we've seen empires, Western empires, all throughout history. We're just watching the cycle repeat itself.
Yeah. And, I visited the dry port, it's called, in Horgos, which borders, it sits on the border of Kazakhstan and Ili province in Xinjiang. So you can literally stand in China and Kazakhstan at the same time because they share a border. But this dry port has actually cut in half the freight time. So in the past, a lot of Chinese companies would have to, in order to export to that part of the world, Central Asia, they would actually have to either drive across the whole country, which is impossible, or put it on a boat and sail across. Now, and then port themselves. Now, though, they've cut that travel time in half through this dry port, which has freight and trains and various things to transport Chinese exports. And of course, also key thing here, as you said, mutually beneficial for countries like Kazakhstan and smaller countries, accelerating their ability to to export their goods to China. So hugely important. And it creates this interconnectivity and the synergy between countries that I think is really the problem here. I think the big problem with China for the United States and the West is that it is this kind of development that really makes the U.S. led order, right, this rules-based international order, almost irrelevant, because countries will be able to independently work together without needing to rely on U.S. economic, political, or military subversion. They won't have to worry about it as much if they can independently trade with a big partner like China.
Absolutely. And here, based in Thailand, and I've lived in Asia my entire adult life, and I've seen the transformation here in Southeast Asia because of cooperation with China and how it has vastly improved virtually every aspect of daily life for people living here. And watching U.S. influence fading and the positive Chinese influence growing, and seeing what a difference it makes. Seeing Chinese diplomats coming to Thailand and speaking Thai to their counterparts, instead of expecting everyone around the world to just speak to them in their language like the US does. I mean, it is such a stark contrast in the two approaches and the obvious results. Now, the unfortunate part, and this goes back to what we were saying about Europe ahead of the special military operation, how it was so obviously in Europe's best interest to work closer with Russia and China rather than cut them off. And yet somehow they still ended up cutting themselves off and destroying themselves in the process. That is the danger that still lingers for the entire world. American political capture, American interference around the globe. The National Endowment for Democracy is one of the most dangerous weapons the US wields around the world because it wields it in secret. Hardly anyone is aware of what they're doing, where and what they're doing. The fact that you see people in the comment section repeating NED-funded lies is proof to that. Here in Thailand, for example, as obvious as the benefits of working with China are, you will see these US-funded opposition groups working day and night because they don't care about the best interests of Thailand. They care about their own personal short-term best interests. Even if there's no country for them to live in the future, they're not thinking that far. And the NED, the US government, the NED target people like this on purpose because the only ones, I don't know any other way to put it, they're the only ones dumb enough to trade their future for short-term fame and fortune and money and recognition from the US. This is what they've done in Bangladesh. So they have achieved regime change there. That's what they're trying to do here in Thailand. This is what they've been working on in Myanmar, which has resulted in a horrific war there, destroying people's prospects for a normal future for years and years to come. And it's something that needs to be guarded against because no matter how little sense it makes to work with the US and their project for unipolar primacy, if they politically capture your country, that's what your country is going to end up working towards. Unfortunately, the power of propaganda is still extremely persuasive. So no matter how contrary it is to people's best interests, the US, with enough money and time, can convince people to work completely opposite their own best interests. Look at Ukraine. Look at what they've convinced thousands, if not millions, of Ukrainians to do to themselves and their future on behalf of Washington. That is a wake-up call for how important it is to manage information space as a national security domain on equal footing with your land borders, your airspace, and your shores.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, and this is a controversial opinion, but China's ability to do this and to do it effectively, unironically too, doing so while also maintaining a very laissez-faire, so to speak, policy on things like VPN usage. But nonetheless, China's ability to regulate, some would call it surveillance or repression, but really what it is a regulation that China has had to ensure that it can build up its own capacity to spread information within China so that people can communicate with each other first before being subject to external forms of information that might actually lead them into color revolution activity or something of the sort. That has been a huge boon. I mean, and all across the board, every time I go to China, Brian, what I see is that it's really the US and the West that's losing out dramatically. I mean, there's a story from earlier in the summer here. Russia airspace ban forces British Airlines to drop key China flights. So British Airways, because of sanctions on Russia, can't fly through Russian airspace. So they've actually lost a lot of business to China because they can't fly the most direct route to China. They have to fly around, and that's a nightmare. If anyone knows anything about the airline industry, which is already a nightmare, and so to speak, in many ways, because of the way it is totally unregulated. But just for airline travel, it's a nightmare to have to travel around Russian airspace in order to try to get to China from London or any other part of the UK. So all of this is to say is that it's really the United States and the West that are losing out. You can go to China and get you get a top of the line electric vehicle that can go 600 kilometers plus per charge. You can get that for 20,000-30,000 US dollars. Incredibly cheap compared to the people are buying junk diesel vehicles here in the United States. They're paying double that in many ways for top of the line. If you get top of the line, you're paying double, triple that. So you're talking about China being able to innovate itself to produce its own electric vehicles to the point where they are cheap enough for people to be able to purchase. And people don't have to buy top of the line. You can get a perfectly good electric vehicle in China for much less than that. In the United States, it's unheard of. You can't. Go buy a Tesla. Go buy the the lesser version of Tesla. You're basically you're paying that amount in the United States. So it's really the United States and the West that are losing in so many domains.
Yes, and it's all because they cannot give up on the idea of primacy and domination, which is, this, again, it will be their undoing. But think about it. The airline example, that's a very interesting one. And I think I remember also a news story where they were complaining to Chinese airlines saying, it's not fair that you're flying across Russia. It's like, why isn't that fair?
Right, because Chinese airlines, yes, they have the advantage unless you do what the United States had done, which is basically cut off all your connections to Chinese airlines. But yes, I think the problem was that Chinese airlines don't have to worry about that. But continue.
So between that and what we've seen Europe do to themselves regarding Russia, just this self-inflicted economic catastrophe, and what we see it building up. And then when we look at articles where they admit their strategy to wage war on China is to just destroy international commerce and just destroy the entire global economy. When you really think about it, it's like when you have cancer, they can't cut it out. And so what they do is they do chemo, and they hope the chemo kills the cancer before it kills you yourself. And that's their big strategy now, is we're going to destroy the entire planet, try to strangle China in the process, and hopefully we survive the outcome, and then we will rebuild as the sole global hegemon. I mean, this is crazy, but this is literally what they're writing in their policy papers. This is what they're planning to do. This is what they are reorganizing their military to do right now. What's interesting is you were just talking about Chinese electric vehicles, and it's not just that they're somehow subsidized, so they're just cheaper. They're also innovating. They're actually using cutting edge manufacturing. And I was looking at these plans by these US based arms manufacturers, startup companies, and their big thing is we're going to out innovate China. We're going to use software defined manufacturing to, just like Tesla is using, to outproduce Western auto manufacturers in terms of electric vehicles. We will use that to outproduce China. The problem is China's already extensively using software-defined manufacturing. So all of these things that they imagine are all based on the absolute fiction of Western superiority. Somehow they're inherently superior, inherently innovative and creative. Chinese people are just automatons. And they're it's just like a bit. They imagine China is just still like people riding on bicycles around and living in poverty. It is a completely different reality. The reality that they're making their decisions in and the actual reality we live in are two different places. And the disparity between the two are going to create catastrophe for the West and possibly for the world if we're not careful.
Yes, indeed. That's why I encourage people to go to China. It's very easy to go now. It's very easy to travel now. Actually, you can see an explosion of travel vlogging that's been going on actually on YouTube, because a lot more, especially Europeans, are going much more now. But I encourage, especially Americans, to go get that travel visa. Very easy, and see for yourself, because as you said, Brian, yeah, it's not the China that people may have in their minds, that they've been taught from the Western media, especially this time around, because I was actually in Xinjiang a lot longer than I had been the first time I went 4 years ago. You can see the accelerated development. I mean, China is very serious, especially about this interconnectivity and moving westward, because there's a lot of practical needs here. China's manufacturing, as you said, right, is so advanced, so fast. It's producing so much that even China's growing income levels and ability to consume cannot keep pace. So they are looking for new consumer markets, not what the United States and the West have looked for in the past, which is how do we take. No, they're actually looking to give. They want people in the global South. They want people, going towards Central Asia, West Asia, all across Africa, Latin. They want people to be able to buy their stuff, because now they have so much of it. They have so much of this innovative stuff. They want people to be able to buy it, but people can't buy it unless they have developed economies themselves, unless their incomes are higher, unless their industries are more congruent, that there's less uneven development in the world. China is very serious about that. And if you go to Xinjiang, you see it, because Xinjiang is China's. It's a civilization. It's like a country within a country, a nation within a nation. Like, you see how different it is from other parts of China, and you see how much attention is paid to elevating that standard of living there, so that people also can take advantage of the innovation that you were speaking of, that they can be, they can take advantage of, they can consume within it, and also be part of it, that they can get their educations, they can work in these high level, high income fields. I mean, that's really where the future is going for China. And for the United States, I come back here. I know that you pay attention to developments in the West. I mean, it's just so different. It's just so different. You don't. That's not the feeling you get here. You actually get the opposite feeling. You get the feeling that the pendulum is swinging so much in the opposite direction. Any final thoughts, though, Brian? I know we've been on for a while, so any final thoughts?
Well, I mean, the last time I was in China was 2006, and even back then, the contrast between the U.S., which I had just gotten back from visiting, and China was just day and night. Just the amount of industry, construction, business, commerce, everything. It was just off the chart. I'd never seen anything like it in my entire life. And that was back before they had the high-speed rail network, which is now the largest in the world, and all these other infrastructure projects that they're building. They're building a high-speed rail line through Thailand right now. The line in Laos, Thailand's neighbor to the north, which then connects to China directly, that is already completed and in operation. And Thai businesses are looking for ways to connect to it even before the Thai high-speed rail line has been completed. So this is something that people desperately want. They want this. You can see it improving people's lives. This flood of cheap items allows people who previously would never get a hold of any of these type of products. Now they can buy it. Now they can use it to improve their life. They can use it for their businesses. A lot of the stuff that you see in Thailand, these are things for very tiny businesses. They can buy it and they can use it to start their small business because it's so cheap and affordable. And it was something that was just simply not possible when the United States and its ally, Japan, were dominating Southeast Asia all those decades. So it is a transformation. It's something that should be welcomed. The fact that people are planning on destroying the planet to stop this should tell you a lot about the mentality in the collective West and the absolute need for us to prioritize this. And I just want to thank you, Danny, for what you're doing. Your channel has grown quite a bit over the last 2 or 3 years that I've known you. And the alternative media is so important to combat against the disinformation. It's really the West's super weapon is still political capture and propaganda. convincing people to pursue their worst interests, convincing them that somehow it's their best interest or essential for their survival. Convincing the American people that China is their enemy is a masterpiece in propaganda. Just the way they're throwing their whole future away to pursue a very small handful of people's desired primacy over the planet. Yeah, it's crazy. And we have to keep fighting back against it.
Oh, yes. Yes, indeed. And just last thing, as you were talking about that interconnectivity with Thailand, Laos, again, like inside of China, when I was in Ili province, you could see this happening inside of China, where this massive influx of tourism from all over China, the fact that China is much more connected than ever before because of the better roads, the better trains, because of the fact that Xinjiang is no longer riddled in terrorism. Like I interviewed a Uyghur woman and her family. I didn't interview her family, but it was her family home. And what they've done to these lower developed areas is that they've elevated the level of development so that these families can turn their homes into businesses, and they end up essentially using, I mean, it's a really beautiful thing. In the West, we might say this is like selling your culture, but really what they're doing is they're just providing like traditional foods from like, Uyghur culture and traditions, and, traditional coffees and teas and various things. And people will go and pay money to just hang out in the designated areas of their home just to experience what it's like to live life there. And they make money off it, and they've increased their standard of living. They were able to renovate their home. Like this is the kind of higher standard of living that is being afforded to people now because of this development. And of course, this is global too, as you said. The Thai Lao situation, like that is a huge example of how just what one high-speed rail network can do for a country like Laos, and inspiring others to want those same benefits. Because for Laos, it's been a huge boon. Lots of tourism, lots of exchanges, lots of trade that's happening now, connecting Laos to other parts of the region. And of course, Thailand. Oh, why wouldn't Thailand want it? It's like you're right next to each other. Like that. That's it's super important for making more money and being able to meet people's needs. So. But yeah, Brian, I want to really thank you for joining. We're going to actually close here. I want to thank everyone who left a super chat. I'm just going to name you. I see Far, Anthony, Speaking the Truth. I see Kevin. I see Gift of Gab, JB. I won't put you guys up here, so sorry, we don't have time. Tristan, Monzer with a really generous one. Wonderful Can, Raphael, H. Durkin. All of you very generous in giving a super chat. I want you all to go to the video description and be sure to follow Brian's work. You can find his YouTube channel there. And of course, go to the video description and find all the ways you can support this channel further, becoming yearly or monthly members on Patreon, Substack, or YouTube. And there's many more options as well for one-time payments. But Brian, any closing words before we head out of here today?
I'll just thank you for having me on. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. I saw a comment thanking everyone who supports Danny and my work, and I really appreciate that. That's what makes it possible. I mean, I do this full time. I wouldn't be able to do it full time if I didn't have people's support in doing so. And Danny, I know it's the same for you. And it's difficult work, and it's unpleasant work because you're basically fighting a mountain of lies. And we have to be very careful because we can see the U.S. visibly attacking the alternative media. Right now, they're talking about shutting people down, putting them on trial. So this is serious. This is existential for us. And you see how important the information battle is to either convincing people to fight against their best interests or explaining to them how to fulfill their best interests and the tragic consequences of the U.S. winning out in this propaganda war. Look at Ukraine.
Yes, indeed. So sorry, everyone. We weren't able to get to questions. I'm posting all the super chats now because we have some really good questions, but let's hold them for another stream because I will be back and we can get into these questions then. But Brian, thank you so much. Everyone, thank you so much. Thanks for all of your support. And I will be back again soon. Have a good rest of your Friday or Saturday, wherever you are in the world. Take care. Bye-bye.